Hi, everyone. Welcome to Northwestern and our Applied Learning series. This is one of several video dialogues that we've put together where members of our staff get together to discuss some aspect of the college admissions process that is fairly common across the college admissions process, wherever you decide to apply, whether or not it's Northwestern. We know there's a lot of advice out there. We're lobbing ours into the mix. And our real hope for this series, we wanted it to be a dialogue so that we could kind of impress upon whoever's watching that there isn't necessarily one right way to do things in this process. There's rarely a silver bullet that's going to guarantee one outcome or another. And you're going to hear a lot of different things from a lot of different experts and non-experts. And there's probably a lot of good insight you can glean from different folks along the way. So that's our goal here. Today we're going to be talking about recommendations as part of the process. And before we go any further, I thought we'd introduce ourselves. My name is Liz Kinsley. I'm the Director of Admission here at Northwestern. I am also have a faculty appointment in Communication Studies here, which is relevant to this particular conversation only insofar as I do write recommendations for my students here from time to time. And I've also had experience as a college counselor, so on that side of the desk, wrote some recommendations, though not nearly as many as I know educators do all over the country and world. And with me today...
Hi, I'm Robert Ellis. I am an Associate Director of Undergraduate Admission in the office here. I'm also an alum. I graduated in 2012 from the School of Education and Social Policy, and I'm a first-generation college student. I've spent the majority of my career at Northwestern, all of my admissions career at Northwestern.
And I have spent lots of my admissions career at Northwestern and some at other institutions. And like I said, a little bit of college counseling and also teaching English. So I was in the teacher end of this conversation as well, briefly. So let's see. We have a few different topics we want to move through today. I think, first of all, we want to say that this is going to be a session. Most of our applied learning series is really aimed at prospective applicants and students who are looking to begin or kind of immersed in the college admission process. This one, we hope, will be useful to students and educators alike. So we'll be doing our best to speak to both audiences, and sometimes we'll be direct about who may benefit most from the advice that's coming out of our dialogue.
Yeah, and I think it's often relevant for both parties, primarily because students are requesting the recommendation letters, and you want to know what's going into them and what makes a good rec. But then, recommenders are often interested in how can we be the most effective and the most efficient. And we can speak to both of those things and really talk about how you can, manage both sides of that coin.
Yeah. So we wanted to start out with just thinking together about what are we hoping to learn from recommendations in a college application. There's only so many documents you can submit as part of your college application. As for students, these recommendation letters are blessedly something you don't have to write. You just have to ask for them and set the process in motion. But they do comprise a lot of the real estate in a college application. And so we thought we'd kind of start with what are we hoping to learn? What kinds of information and insights can we get out of these? So I'll kick that question to Robert for starters, and we'll bat it back and forth for a bit.
Yeah, I think primarily when I'm reading recommendation letters, my goal is to find, how is a student going to contribute to the learning community at the institution, so at Northwestern. And that can be found in a lot of different ways. I think a lot of folks will focus on like anecdotes, they'll focus on some, personality traits, etc. But overall, the goal is to see, this student, how will they interact in the community at Northwestern? And how do they interact, in their high school community as well? And so primarily, I'm interested in things like collaboration or in, how do you process and deal with adversity? are you willing to ask for help? Like things like that, where maybe students aren't necessarily willing to say those things in their application, but the recommenders know that those are kind of important pieces of the puzzle as far as an application is concerned.
Yeah. And as part of the bigger process of evaluating candidates for our campus or any campus, to Robert's point, this is you kind of enter the application with a question first. Is a student equipped to do the work here, right? Do they have the academic foundation? But in an applicant pool like ours, the answer to that question is most of the time yes. And so we move on to get into more substance in an application. And as we think about who is going to come into this learning community and be a dynamic thinker or an especially productive listener or a provocative interlocutor in the classroom or beyond, the recommendations can really expand our sense of who this student is, particularly in that classroom setting.
Yeah, I like to think of the application in its totality as this kind of narrative that a student's putting together. These recommendation letters are different kind of like subplots to that narrative. And it helps to, kind of get a greater understanding as to the student. And there are just some pieces that other folks see in them that maybe they're not presenting for themselves. And they're often like very nice ways to kind of find out how well-rounded a student is, versus, if you're interested in engineering, it's possible that you're really kind of skewing towards engineering. And then all of a sudden we're in this rec letter and they're talking about how great of an actress you are. And that kind of really excites us.
Yeah. And in terms of the kinds of language I think that can carry across certain information that we are hoping or delighted to see in these recommendations. Sometimes we're not going looking for it and it comes to us. Qualitative language, I think that can kind of describe how a student thinks, how a student listens, as I said before. I think not certainly the students who are the first to raise their hand are always there with an interesting thought or contribution are wonderful to have in a classroom, but so too are the students who sit back and observe and listen and synthesize, and then offer just that right question or comment to move a conversation in a whole new direction. Qualitative language that helps us better understand a student's accountability or a student's focus, a student's maturity, intellectual or otherwise. What kind of ways a student may contribute to a classroom dynamic. Ours is a residential community, and so too are so many colleges that students are looking at if they're thinking about Northwestern, and knowing how a student shapes a group dynamic, right. Especially across a group of folks who may think differently from one another and may come from different backgrounds and things like that. That can be really valuable information. So all of that kind of qualitative language, whether or not it comes with examples, honestly, we'll trust that if you tell us that it's the case, you probably have a few examples to back it up. If you don't feel like documenting all of those examples, that's honestly fine by me. I don't know how you feel about anecdotes and examples in these letters.
Sometimes the anecdotes really help to paint the picture as to, specifically what you're talking about. And I think the beauty of the English language is that you can say things and just mean something completely different. And so sometimes those anecdotes really do help us to understand what it is that you're trying to get at. But at the same time, sometimes they're overdone as well. So, you don't need to write 3 stories about someone's work ethic. You can save yourself some time. I appreciate the work ethic that you have writing the letter, though.
Yeah, absolutely. I think relative language, too, can be really helpful in these letters. So, as we go through our applicant pool, we are assessing a student's relative strength in their high school context and their community context and in our pool-wide context. And these recommendations, I think, can shore up our sense of a student's relative strength and relative dynamism or whatever other qualities within their graduating class, within their school community, within their classroom setting. And so to the extent that you are writing about a student and can give us an impression of how they stand out compared to others in your section that year, across all the sections you taught that year, in the past few years at your high school, in your career. Sometimes we see that best in career praise, and that's really compelling. And it doesn't have to be the most brilliant student in your career, right? There are students that bring forth all kinds of qualities that advance learning in a classroom, whether it's sort of an unusually compassionate student or empathetic or intellectually generous or whatever. But that relative language piece can be really helpful and can kind of cut to the chase, I think, sometimes for us.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to read the thoughts that folks have about the reasons why students learning. I think that's typically spoken in relative terms as well. A love for learning is really important at a place like Northwestern, where we want you to interact with students from across different disciplines. And so, to be able to accomplish that, we need folks that want to learn different disciplines, even though that's not what they're studying. And often a student who learns for the sake of learning is a lot more interested in continuing that. And so we, look for a lot of different things, but the way that students learn or why they learn often kind of strikes me.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, particularly in teacher recommendations.
Yeah.
I think for those of you who are students thinking about whom you may ask as your teacher recommendations, or teachers who are tuning in, the why behind what a student brings to the classroom every day is really compelling, and how they shape the experience for others around them, I think, can be equally compelling. And certainly their intellectual chops, those things. Some students are just like knock you out brilliant, and you got to tell us that. And sometimes I find myself writing a recommendation, and at the end I just kind of have to add in that I simply like this person, that they are nice to have around. And those kind of just, informal, just from the heart comments, or just honest comments about how fun a student is, how funny they are, what they, how you've seen them grown up over the course of their time in high school. That can be really useful.
Yeah, some comments that really express to me how great a student is. I'd like my kid to be like them. I would let them babysit my children. I mean, that's trust.
Yeah, that is trust. Yeah.
So
absolutely. I don't know if you all want to babysit my 4-year-old. She's a lot right now. But I would trust a lot of you to do it. Counselor recs are just, since we've kind of touched specifically on teacher recs, our particular process, we require at least one teacher recommendation from an academic subject. We most often see two. And a recommendation from a counselor, college counselor, or a high school administrator. And I think that latter recommendation, those can really differ, most often based on the size of the high school, the setup of the high school, the bandwidth of the person writing the letter relative to their caseload, things like that. But across the board, I think those counselor recs can fundamentally help us gain that sense of a student's relative academic performance and the relative rigor of their curriculum, really, within the context of their graduating class. And often they can also give us a sense of that student's community involvement and impact relative to their graduating class. But that relative to their graduating class piece is often what we're trying to get at most with that counselor recommendation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree.
Or within the context of their graduating class, I could say, rather than relative to, but.
Yeah, we acknowledge the fact that a lot of counselors just have large caseloads, and that's just kind of the reality of it. And so our expectations as college admissions counselors are, not necessarily that you know the student really well, and that you can say all of these really personal things. And so there's a lot that we can gain from understanding a student's academics and how they are, relative to the other students in their class, or their involvement, or, the various things that they do that might go unnoticed by the student but were noticed by you. Yeah. Like a student who maybe ran for class president and didn't win, but then continues to participate in student government, even though, it's their last year. Like, that sort of thing really speaks a lot, just kind of about a student's character. So there are ways that even if you don't know a student, you can really kind of help benefit them.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we move on to the next kind of section that we wanted to address, I think, as Robert and I were speaking earlier, and as we train new readers, one thing that I always try to impress upon them is to listen to the recommendations. You as an admission reader or reviewing files, you are meeting someone very quickly, meeting them in sort of figurative terms, but I always feel like I'm meeting them. And you're meeting them briefly, you are meeting them in a very transactional circumstance, and you're meeting them in a very kind of fabricated circumstance to the extent that they've curated this look into their world and at who they are and who they think they might become in college. And we can make the most of that. We're really looking across different pieces of the application to corroborate the other pieces. And the recommendations, maybe foremost, are doing that for us, right? Yep. This is who we think we've met. Oh, yes, this same person shows up in this recommendation and this recommendation. And now we really think we've got a sense for who this is. But listen to those recommendations, because they see them every day. They see them show up in good days, bad days. They see them show up for their friends, and know that we really value those insights. Yeah. And I think some recommendations aren't going to teach us that much. That's just the reality of it. Mm-hmm. To Robert's point, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, but some teachers just don't have the bandwidth to write with much substance, and we completely understand that. Some recommendations are just, frankly, going to read a lot like most of the recommendations or a lot of the recommendations in our pool, right? Very positive, and we'll learn all good things, but may sound very similar to other positive recommendations. And then often you'll learn something really remarkable about a student in a recommendation, or unremarkable but equally important about how good this person is, or what a good thinker or learner they are. And we have to listen to that. We have to trust that the teachers know these individuals better than we ever could in this process. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
No, I think you covered it. You all know them better than we do, and so we trust what you're saying. Yeah,
and we do read the letters. That I should have started with that, because I do sometimes hear teachers say, "Do you even read these letters?" And we'll dig in, and we'll sometimes even come find you if we have a question. Mm-hmm. If there's a comment or something in a letter that is a complete outlier to that point about corroborating other aspects of the application, if it's a complete outlier, sometimes we'll say, "Well, we don't want this to take down the whole application if there's not much weight to it, but let's poke a little further, let's look a little further and see what you may have meant there." Or on the flip side, if there's some, award or something that didn't come through the rest of the application that seems like a big major deal that we should have known about, we'll poke on that too. We'll shift gears here. We wanted to talk about who best to ask and when should you be asking your teachers. And we think this will benefit students first and foremost, but hopefully if you're an educator listening, this could, maybe you'll learn something here.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Yeah. My wife works at a high school, and students ask for recommendation letters up until the last day. And then they're really stressed because the application is due and they really want this letter written, and people really are working. And so it's just best to give people time. And so if you can identify somebody that you'd like to write a letter of recommendation for you by the end of your junior year, and give that teacher the opportunity or that counselor the opportunity to write the letter, on their own time, because often they're not writing them at school. They're writing them after hours anyway. And so giving them the opportunity to actually sit down and to think about it would be really, really helpful under a lot of circumstances for teachers.
Yeah.
And then on the other side of that, too, it's also, we often get asked about who should write the letter. And sometimes, rather aggressively, folks will ask us about if it should be their senior year teachers. And by the time you've applied to college, your senior year teachers maybe know you 2-3 months often. And so you want someone to be able to kind of speak to you across the year. And so a lot of times the most effective teachers are your junior year teachers.
Yeah, I think having a junior year teacher in the mix is probably a good idea. If you have a sophomore year teacher who knows you especially well and around a particular subject area, or they may be also a coach or something like that and a teacher, certainly feel free to ask that person and find the right balance with all the teachers you choose to ask. Some colleges will actually require that you submit recommendations across certain subject areas. We don't, and I think that my advice would be to first try to kind of keep some kind of chart around the colleges that you're applying to, so that you make sure you're satisfying the requirements of the colleges you're applying to, and economizing your efforts and your teacher's efforts. So if one of the colleges you're applying to requires that you're asking a math teacher and a humanities teacher, we're happy for those two teachers to be your recommenders for us too. So just try to stay organized on that front. But as far as we're concerned, any discipline, particularly a core academic discipline, is going to be sufficient for our requirements. And as you think about who to ask, think about a class, maybe not where you got the best grade, or where you were the highest performing student in the class. That may be the person you want to ask, but really think about where your best qualities as a learner are shown through. If you can kind of tap into that self-awareness and give yourself a pat on the back for having those qualities in the first place. What classroom setting did those shine through? And don't feel that your teacher recommendations need to be necessarily the space in your application that emphasize your math chops if you're a prospective engineer, or your writing ability if you are a prospective journalist. That can be really useful, but as a prospective engineer, your English teacher may have the best insight into the way you shape a class dynamic, right? And that can be really useful. Having written recommendations for the students who've taken my Northwestern seminar, which is a cultural studies course on adaptation, I've written med school recommendations, and that's always fun because I can really speak to certain qualities that would probably make for a fantastic physician, and have nothing to do with how well that student may sort of achieve in a STEM classroom or in a lab. But I think those insights can be really useful as you think about who best to ask for your recommendations.
Yeah. This past year, a student got a letter from, I also read transfer files, but they got a letter from a biology teacher, and they were majoring in English or something similar. And the faculty just really spoke a lot about how she just never gave up, and how, she struggled and she just came to office hours and she did all of these, things to improve. And it just took a lot of courage to say, would you please write me a recommendation letter and speak to this? And it was a very compelling part of her application.
Yeah.
Because it just spoke to the fact that she's willing to ask for help when she needs it. And I think that those are the things that we often overlook. When you're applying to college, you often think about, presenting your best self, but sometimes your best self also is, how do you, tackle this adversity?
Yeah.
And you might consider a recommender who can speak to that.
Yeah, your best qualities as a learner may have shown through in a circumstance where you were really struggling to perform at a high level academically, right? But those qualities as a learner, the joy you took in it, or the ways you asked for help, or the types of questions you even asked to clarify, right? The courage it took to say, I don't understand, can we do that again? And the way in which that may have supported others around you who were not comfortable saying they didn't understand. All those qualities can be really helpful in these types of recommendations. And give your teachers the tools to write a strong recommendation. Yeah. As you think about why you may want a particular teacher to write a recommendation, if you are doing that kind of reflective work of, okay, what are my strongest qualities as a learner and where did those come through? Mm-hmm. Maybe give your teacher some points that you hope that they would cover in their letter. That would really help out a person who's writing dozens of recommendations and certainly has all the respect in the world for you, but may be at a loss for just how to start another letter on a long day of writing. Note that certain teachers who really get a lot of requests, those AP US history teachers, yes. AV Calc teachers, they may have their own processes and deadlines for requesting a recommendation, so make sure you check in so that you are meeting those deadlines and filling out whatever forms they require to help them, again, do right by you as a recommender. Anything else? Supplement. Do you want to talk a little bit about supplemental recs? We get a lot of those questions.
Yeah, if there's something that you really want to be said in your application that's just not said, and you have already realized that the universities and the colleges that you're applying to accept supplemental information or supplemental recommendation letters, it could be a good idea to get one. So maybe you want the pastor at your church to talk about the community service that you've been involved in, or your philanthropy efforts, things like that. That might be a good way to kind of add that to your application, would be through a letter like that. Or maybe you spend a ton of your time playing basketball, and maybe the coach was never your teacher, but potentially they have a lot to say about you and the things that you have accomplished in your work ethic, and so that might be a good person to get a letter from as well. But you just want to take note as to which schools you're applying to accept supplemental information, because that's really important. There are situations in which potentially a teacher might be able to speak to who you are, but you've never taken their class. And so that might be a coach or someone who is the advisor for an organization that you're part of. And those would be good folks to get letters from as well.
Yeah. Some institutions may say they're not able to accept supplemental recommendations or supplemental materials. Just check in with them. There may be a gray area in terms of the types of recommendations they're able to take into consideration. And there are times, the question you want to ask yourself when it comes to supplemental materials, and particularly supplemental letters of recommendation, is this person going to say something new?
Yes.
If it is a teacher who is a huge fan of yours and chimes in with high praise that is more or less comparable to and repetitive of the other high praise that's been across your application, that's great, but it's probably not going to add more, and it's going to maybe even bloat the effect of your application. That said, if there is somebody in your life, to Robert's earlier point, who has insight into another area of your day-to-day and who you are and what you could contribute, and who you might become as a college student, go ahead and ask them. I think in particular, we're an institution, for example, that we don't accept art portfolios. We don't have a way that faculty review those, or dance portfolios, so or research portfolios, writing portfolios. We just don't have a process worked out with faculty to review those, and so it can be very helpful to have a letter from somebody with expertise in a particular area to weigh in about the extent of your talents or your dedication, your commitment, your contributions in an area like that. Just use your judgment when it comes to supplemental recommendations. If you think you're getting tiresome in the amount of stuff you've put in your application, that's a good self-awareness checkpoint to
Yeah.
say, maybe this is not a moment of good judgment. But otherwise, the information is usually useful to us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. We wanted to talk a little bit about some contextual considerations, and we've touched on a few of these, but we know that recommendations are not going to look the same for every student necessarily, and there are a number of reasons why. So we just wanted to touch on a few of those considerations so that we can kind of manage expectations and not put anyone in a panic about what their recommendations may look like compared to other folks in our pool. I don't know if you want to start with some, or we can...
Yeah, it's the big one has been the pandemic, particularly in how that has shaped students' experiences in school. And it's happened across the country, across the world. And we fully acknowledge it. And we also acknowledge that it has impacted folks differently. And so some people had to take on more responsibility. Maybe you're in a house with a bunch of people who, are just loud. And that would have been me and my family, right? And so, how did that impact your kind of learning experience and the environment that you were in? Those things are important, and that context can be brought out in recommendation letters. And it can help to understand kind of relatively, how the student was impacted, and kind of what they did to, keep going, keep trucking along, keep doing well.
Yeah.
And recommenders over the past few years have been really good about that.
Yeah, that's really true. I was thinking also, on the flip side of that, there have been plenty of circumstances that have compromised students' ability to get to know their teachers as well as they might have, or to master the material as well as they may have, in that loud setting perhaps. But we know that too. And some of the letters just don't have the same substance that they may have in previous years because folks didn't get a chance to know each other as well. And we're absolutely mindful of that going into applications. The other, and we've acknowledged this in various ways throughout this conversation, but I think what is the average caseload for college counselors in the U.S. is something like 400 students.
400, yeah.
And we remind ourselves of that number a lot so that we are really realistic about what the bandwidth of certain counselors is to write with much substance or to get to know students in an extremely personal way. So again, we are going to meet those recommendations and recommenders where they are. We won't hold it against a student if a teacher is not able to spend tons of time on a letter, things like that. We really do, as much as we want to listen to the recommendations when they have something to tell us, we're not going to overstate the importance of or the weight of a recommendation, particularly in circumstances where it's outside of a student's and a recommender's control, really what they're able to make of that piece of the application, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think about a very clear example would be you're at a smaller school, it has 3 AP classes, everyone asks those 3 teachers for a recommendation letter, and so it's possible they don't have the capacity. And while it would be nice to get a letter from one of the more or the most rigorous courses that you've taken, it's fine if you can't.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fair too. Other contextual factors? I think those were the biggies that we wanted to hit.
Yeah, that feels good.
Yeah.
Other than teachers, I also acknowledge you have classes of 31, 32 students. You have 5 classes a day. That's a lot of potential letters of recommendation.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. And I think that may be a nice segue into the last area we wanted to cover. We wanted to just share some thoughts that may or may not be useful to folks who are actually writing these recommendations. So students, you could turn us off now, although if you keep listening, maybe you'll learn something. Yeah. But one of the questions that we get a lot, and this, I don't know, I feel like it came into the into fashion several years ago, but seems still to be a point of anxiety, is whether to use bullets versus write in full paragraph form for these recommendations. And we're both like team bullets.
Love bullets.
We had over 51,000 applications to review last year. As you can tell by how long we've been talking about this, we do pay attention to the teacher recommendations and to the counselor recommendations. And so I think bullets and brevity do not have to mean compromising on substance, specificity, or any kind of praise that you may want to heap on this student. Ineloquence is not going to compromise those things, right? Substance can come through in very efficient ways, and we're pro that. Whatever helps make your job easier, and it will probably make our job easier too, frankly, without compromising outcomes for the student. So go ahead with those if you're feeling it.
Yeah, I also think about you probably have a great template for recommendation letters, and so you often copy and paste a lot of it, and that's as efficient as possible. Some of our hope would be that you would use different descriptors or descriptors that help us to understand where a student falls in their class or relative to other students in your career. We have a big applicant pool. And so we often get many apps from high schools, and so it's possible that we'll see a recommendation letter 3 or 4 times. And so if it's a copy and paste sort of job, it really kind of takes away from the weight of it, I would think.
Yeah, we wouldn't hold it against a student, but it's really, I think, to Robert's point, templates are necessary in many cases. And there are going to be times over the however many letters you've written where you've gotten just the right way to say something about the kind of student someone is, and that kind of student plays out many times across a classroom. That's great. Yes. Or you're kind of characterizing the content of your class or the extent of your own career. It's when you're copy pasting superlatives, that relative language. I find that there are some sentences where in teacher recs where I want to write it down because it's so compelling with respect to that. So I write it down, and then I'm reading all the same applicants, all applicants from the same high school, and I've start writing it down again for another applicant, and I'm like, oh, I just wrote the same thing down for someone 2 applicants ago, and it's something like they have the most rare intellect, or or it's something like, it's not that extreme, but basically that's when things start to water down.
Yes.
When you say, okay, that's, I'm not gonna hold this against the student, but it does certainly dilute the impact of that
Absolutely.
gem of language or praise that you've offered up. So, but I don't think that means no templates whatsoever. I think those are just realistic and functional, and there's going to be a certain amount of language that you need to reuse.
Absolutely. I mean, every AP US history teacher has to talk about their curriculum.
Yeah.
And it's the same paragraph for everyone. And it's great the first time, and it has to be in there. And I wouldn't expect you to change a word of it.
Yeah. And then I was thinking we could talk a little bit. There are with the standard recommendation forms with our applications, there are kind of grids on the front of those that encourage that kind of relative, like the student, their maturity, intellectual maturity is, top in my career or good or top 5%, whatever it is. We look at those grids. If you give them to us, they can be really helpful. And some teachers and counselors choose not to use them.
Yeah.
We don't go looking for them if they're not there. So it's up to you, but know that we do look at them if we've got them. I think they can be a helpful measure, particularly if some quality is like an outlier on either end of the scale. We'll take note of that, and then again try to see if we can link that back to the rest of the application and make sense of it in the broader context.
Yeah. And the grids are a useful tool, for you as well. So it is, even if you don't submit it, could help you to contextualize what it is that you'd like to write.
Absolutely. That's good advice. I think we're winding down here. Any other advice for folks writing the letters?
No.
Thank you
Yeah.
for writing the letters. It's a lot of work, and we clearly appreciate them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely appreciate them.
Yeah. And for the students still watching, thank your teachers, first of all.
Yes.
We'll sometimes do mock application committees with students and families to teach them about the application process. And I'm always struck by how invested folks get in the teacher recommendations, and that aha moment where they realize how much that set of voices can shape your impression of a candidate. Because again, as a student who's applying, this is like a wonderful situation where you don't have to do the writing as a busy high school student. So even in that case, don't lose sight of the substance that these can lend to your application, and thank your teachers and appreciate the ways in which this part of the application process can also invite self-reflection, I think. Absolutely.
And do know that the teachers talk to each other, so your reputation will make it into the recommendation letter.
In good ways,
Yes.
in good ways. Well, thank you for spending another Applied Learning series with us. Robert, it's been fun chatting.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Pleasure.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Have a good one.
Take care.